Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like or subscribe to Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us.
Cleaning Up is brought to you by Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebreich Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. My guest today is Julia Pyke, and she's the Director of Financing for Sizewell C, and that's the next gigawatt-scale nuclear power station that EDF wants to build on the UK's Suffolk coast. Please join me in welcoming Julia Pyke to Cleaning Up. So, Julia, great to see you. Thanks for joining us here on Cleaning Up.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Michael.
Let's start by you explaining what your role is, because there's Sizewell C and there's EDF, and exactly where do you sit within that and what is it you do?
So I spent most of my career in the law in the city. I was the head of power for Herbert Smith Freehills, and I was inspired by having done so many years of work to get Hinkley over the line to financial close, by the idea that we must make use of all of that work and get a second project over the line. So I left the law and came to EDF in order to develop Sizewell. So that's to agree with government how it's going to move forward and to raise the considerable quantities of money that we need to hit financial close and build the power station.
Okay, so, and you are now financing director for Sizewell C, which is different from finance director, who presumably doesn't exist yet, but you're the financing director.
That's right. There is a finance director who looks after the money that we have, but it's my job to agree with government how we're going to finance nuclear, get it on a stable footing, get a fleet build approach, and to then raise the money.
So, Julia, that makes you one of the great experts in the world on gigawatt nuclear. Gigawatt scale nuclear, that's the big plants, the sort that, that deliver most of the nuclear power today.
That's right. That's the sort of reactor for which there are designs available today, which we can get on with building.
Right. And so perhaps just walk us through what are the economics, because I have in the past and quite frequently said that the economics of those gigawatt scale plants has been tested to destruction, so that we should not be building them because they're too darn big, they're too darn complicated, they take too long, they go off over budget, and so we should move on. Now, you presumably, given your role, would disagree, but tell us why.
I certainly would disagree. And what I'd say is that the economics are complicated by the comparisons that people make. What is a nuclear power station to be compared to? It's not the same as wind, it's not the same as solar, it's not doing the same job. So the economic justification for nuclear in the UK, and the economics in different countries are different, but in the UK, if you build the right amount of nuclear, gigawatt or SMR, but nuclear, then it actually makes household bills go down. The reason it makes household bills go down is because although people look at the megawatt hour price of wind or solar, people don't generally calculate the whole cost of the system and the impact on the electricity bill. So we've done modelling, which is based on the modelling which government itself uses, based on the government's own assumptions. And that modelling shows that if you build the right amount of nuclear, if you build, for example, 20 gigawatts, then household bills will go down by round about £180 a year. And that if you go ahead and build Sizewell itself, then household bills will go down by a range, because of course it will depend on what Sizewell ultimately costs, but a range of say between £30 and £50 a year. It will be cheaper to have nuclear than not have nuclear, even though the nuclear power station in itself is, as you say, Michael, expensive to build.
Okay, and that's £30 to £50, that's just for Sizewell, or is that including the impact of Hinkley, which is, or as we know, already being built?
Well, it's the impact of adding Sizewell.
The impact of adding Sizewell. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and so if I'm sort of paraphrasing, and feel free to sort of disagree if I get it wrong, it is more expensive on a per megawatt hour basis, but because it fulfills certain roles, it comes in at different times and it's got different reliability and so on. It doesn't compete with the wind and the solar and the cheap stuff. It actually competes with other things that could be very, very expensive. And therefore, overall, it pushes the price down, not up. Is that Is that a good sort of summary?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I actually feel passionately that in order to have a successful nuclear industry, we have to identify the right role for nuclear. And it's absolutely not the case that nuclear is competing with renewables. Nuclear should be supporting the growth of renewables, fulfilling a different role.
Okay, but how does that work in practice? Because what you can't do with nuclear, and I don't think it's what you're proposing, is that it sits there doing nothing. And then when the wind drops and the sun isn't shining, so one of those famous, they call it in Germany, the Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums, and you've got, I don't know, 2 weeks every year or two, and then suddenly you fire up the nuclear and it only works for that short period. I mean, that would be enormously expensive. I mean, orders of magnitude too expensive, right?
Yeah, that would be bananas. But so you're quite right, that's not what we're proposing. What we're proposing is to make the nuclear effectively flexible in 2 ways. The first way is to extract heat for the first time from a UK nuclear power station. So we'll be able to extract steam at around 270 degrees before it hits the turbines. And you can extract around 400 megawatt thermal of steam from a UK EPR without significantly impacting electrical output. If you want to, you can make the safety case to extract more steam, but that's obviously more work to make that case. And then the second thing is to make sure that the power station is connected for non-grid uses of electricity. So in an ideal world, where you didn't need all that electricity on the grid from time to time, it would be working in harmony with renewables, co-powering, for example, green electrolysis for hydrogen.
Okay, so let me come back to the first. We're going to talk about this quite a bit, but let me come back to just the first of those. You said 400 megawatt thermal of steam at 270 degrees. That strikes me as being not a byproduct. I mean, steam at that temperature, that's presumably at some kind of secondary generating stage. So it is surely costing you electricity to do that.
Well, I'm not a physicist and I don't want to be picked up on the exact details of this, but I am reliably informed that at 400 megawatt thermal, it does not significantly impact electrical output because of the innate efficiency or inefficiency of the processes in the power station itself.
Now, what people can't see who are listening on the podcast, and it may even be edited and cropped out on the YouTube version, is that behind me, there is a book called Elements of Nuclear Power by D.J. Bennett. Now, which is sort of to prove that I actually did study nuclear, although I did study it. I have to be completely open and transparent. My studying of nuclear finished in 1984. So although I probably, in a previous life could have masqueraded as a bit of a physicist and a nuclear expert, I'm not anymore at all. So we're pretty much on a level playing field there. It just strikes me that, with 270 degrees steam, I know processes, organic Rankine cycle, for instance, that you could put that through and extract more electricity. But the fundamental point that you're making is that it's going to be a flexible resource in the way it's used within the electrical system, within the energy system of the UK, right?
Yes, that's right. This is steam which, broadly speaking, might otherwise go to waste, and instead we want to use it. And likewise, there are things that you can do with the warm water which emerges at the end of all of the processes. So water emerges at temperatures which are still useful, for example, for district heating. So if you to absolutely make the most use of your power station, and you look at that alongside all the sort of social benefits of building nuclear, then you can make more of it. You can make the most of it for the community and actually for UK consumers as a whole.
Now, there's probably people listening to this who are not quite familiar with the way nuclear is used, who will say, wait a minute, warm water going straight from a nuclear power station into the district heating and then circulating around every home. What could possibly go wrong? And so on. But there are actually secondary loops and separations. And in fact, certainly in China, there's discussion about potentially building nuclear that does nothing but district heating, never generates any electricity at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And in countries which have historically valued heat more highly, so in Finland, in Sweden, in Russia, nuclear has been used for district heating for a very long time. The steam is clean. I have to stress the steam is not radioactive steam, it's steam.
Right, okay. So we've established that it can be used flexibly and that the heat is a sort of key weapon. But nevertheless, I'm going to push you on the cost of the power, because there are other ways of generating power that is dispatchable, that can be used when there's no wind and when there's no sun. And there's lots of discussion about, it could be around using CCS, it could be around hydrogen, it could be around using, obviously, pumped storage, connecting to more connections to perhaps Norway, or even building more pumped storage of our own. Of course, people talk about batteries, although I suspect that the volume there is quite small. So you still do need to be affordable, do you not?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an absolute imperative to be affordable, and alongside saying that I don't think we're competing with renewables, I personally think that we need to try everything. I'm fully in favour of the development of CCUS, and indeed pumped storage, if people will accept the consequences of all of these things. I think you shouldn't rule out a technology which works, and which actually, in comparison with household bills without building it, will bring them down. And I think that is absolutely key to the justification for this. Then I think you should also build nuclear. We foresee this huge growth in the need for electricity and for low carbon electricity, and nuclear has a part to play in it, which is to be in the mix.
Right, but there's a big jump between saying, well, we should rule nothing out, which sounds very sort of, collegial, and saying that we should spend literally tens of billions keeping it in. And, we're not, it's kind of, we got, well, not quite 10 minutes in, and we're going to have to talk about Hinkley, aren't we? I mean, Hinkley, which was, I think from 2006 was a big part of your life, was pushing through Hinkley. Yeah. And Hinkley, eventually the deal was done in 2016, which was £92.50 in 2012 money per megawatt hour for 35 years, growing with inflation.
Yeah.
Right? And that makes it, over the course of its life, although it was a 20-something billion pound project to build, or it is because it's currently being built, the total amount that will be paid for the electricity during the 60-year life or whatever it is of Hinkley. In fact, no, just during the 35 years of its contract for difference, the total amount paid in real terms, not undiscounted, but in real terms, is nearly £100 billion. So we committed to spending £100 billion, I think the number's 96 billion, on electricity from Hinkley C. The UK's, the National Audit Office thought that about 30 billion of that was a subsidy. And that's for 3.2 gigawatts. Yeah. So not that huge of a supply, and a 30 billion pound subsidy on a 96 billion pound purchase. I mean, how can that possibly make sense?
Well, I'm not here to comment on the exact deal which was done on Hinkley, but the nuclear industry needed to get going again. It was the first build of its kind for a generation that the UK hadn't built since, I think, was it 1995, the Sizewell B turned on. And the costs of building nuclear are something which most definitely need attention. They need attention from the industry, or indeed they're getting attention, but they also need attention from all the people around the industry. So the government, the regulators, the supply chain, sort of the whole system which builds nuclear needs attention. And of course, the financing mechanism needed attention. That's what we've given particular attention to, or that's what I have given particular attention to for Sizewell C. Others are looking at how to practically reduce the build costs. And I think it's really important to explain to people that of the £92.50, only sort of 11 to 13 pounds or so actually represents the cost of construction. Around £20 per megawatt hour represents the cost of operating, that's including fuel. And the rest of it represents the cost of money. And the cost of money was made up partly of running along an interest bill from the point at which work started in earnest. As you said, I was appointed at Herbert Smith Freehills in 2006. The power station will turn on in 2027. And that's a long old time to have your money out without any interest being paid. And of course, the cost of capital reflected that the whole of the construction risk sat with EDF, the developer.
And do we get a sense of what that average cost of capital, the unleveraged, as the project cost of capital was for Hinkley? Is there a figure that's out there that you can share with us?
I think it was all published at the time. I think it was around about 9%. And lots of things are said about Hinkley. And I mean, in particular, I imagine that at any moment you're going to quote the Vincent de Rivaz 2017 Turkey quote. So Vincent said that Hinkley will be cooking UK's turkeys by Christmas 2017. And so people forever say that Hinkley's late. But Hinkley is not late other than really due to COVID. It's actually running pretty well on time. It's a great success story. The issue with Hinkley is that it took 10 years to do all the paperwork. It wasn't signed up and able to get going until 2016. So if we wanted to pursue the turkey analogy, which has absolutely dogged us in journalistic terms, if I can mix my animal metaphors, we could say that government didn't build the oven until 2016. So in 2017, that turkey would have been quite raw. Hinkley is actually a huge success story. There are thousands of people there who are completely dedicated to building nuclear for the first time in a generation. If you want a flavour of it, you can look at the BBC Two documentary. And although, of course, COVID has impacted Hinkley as it's impacted everything else, absent COVID, it's running round about 6 months behind schedule. So, I mean, I think I'd just like to pay tribute to my colleagues at Hinkley, because I think the people who build net zero infrastructure are not always identified as climate heroes, but really they are. They're there day in, day out, all weathers, building this infrastructure.
Right, so you got your turkey reference in early. I wanted to come back to the time it takes to build these things. And of course, the reference that Julia is making there for the purpose of the audience was Vincent de Rivaz, who was the CEO of EDF UK I think from 2002 through till about 2000, probably 17 or 18, I'm not sure. But what he said, going back to, was it 2006? He said, or 2007, he said that Hinkley would be, electricity from Hinkley would be cooking our Christmas turkeys by 2017. And, I think you're right to point out that the building of Hinkley is being well managed. But what was extraordinarily naive, perhaps, of Vincent was to think that there would be a decision within maybe 10 years as an extended period. But if he thought that he was going to get a decision in 2006 or 7 under the Blair-Brown regime, whose only goal in life was to kick this sort of thing into the long grass, as far as I can see, he must have been extremely naive to think that. I mean, I actually want to come back to the costs, if you don't mind. Because, the £92.50 really is £118 in today's money. I think it's really important that we understand just how expensive Hinkley is. It's £118 per megawatt hour. For those in the audience who are not familiar, if you were to generate in normal times, generating power from gas would be about maybe £8. The offshore wind, we've got the contracts for difference at £50. I think that's also in 2012 money, so maybe at £60. But we've got offshore wind elsewhere in Europe that's at about €50 or even less. So, we're talking about Hinkley being essentially 2.5 times what wholesale electricity prices have been until recently. And right now it's, of course, much higher because of the situation with the price squeeze coming out of COVID, but also the Russia aggression on Ukraine, which has also pushed the price of gas up. But mostly wholesale electricity prices are £30 to £50, and Hinkley is £118. That's just to put it all in perspective, right?
So I think it comes back to something we touched on earlier, which is, what are you buying? And as you say, today, prices are more like £200. Today, if Hinkley was on, it would be saving consumers around about £1 billion a year. Of course, I realise I've now offered you the open goal to point out to me that it's not on, but I'm going to go back to my...
And I think let me come in there, because I wouldn't talk about it's not on, because we've, I've understood, I've dealt with, when we've talked about the turkeys and how long it's on, and we'll come back to that for some other projects. But what I would say is that the current wholesale price of electricity, which is driven up, horrendously at the moment, is not going to be there for 35 years. So, yes, it's an example of an insurance perhaps paying off, but it's paying off much, much less than the cost of the policy.
I think it comes back to what are you buying when you buy nuclear. You're buying greater energy security, and that's not something which has habitually been priced in. You're buying, as you said, an alternative to currently very expensive forms of storage. And the reason that I am so passionate about Sizewell being flexible to fit in with the future system is that I'm very keen that nuclear is providing this form of assurance, that it's doing the role it's needed to do over time, that you're building a machine which can fulfill the role you need it to fulfill. So absolutely, £118 is a lot more expensive than offshore wind. But as I said at the start, building Sizewell will literally bring household bills down. And that's actually what people ultimately really care about.
Okay, but let's move from Hinkley. I mean, the Hinkley deal I've called, I think I called it the worst deal since, I think it was the Russia took the wrong side of the Alaska Purchase. It's of that order of magnitude stupid, was how I characterized it. And then one of the justifications, though, is that you get the nuclear industry restarted and all the benefits start to flow. And of course, that brings you to Sizewell. So how much cheaper will Sizewell be than Hinkley? Are we talking about a third of the price? Are we talking about half the price? Are we talking about 20% cheaper? What are your figures telling you?
Well, I think it's going to be 20% cheaper or more. And the reason that we can't give you a figure is not because we are attempting to be evasive, but because we're obviously negotiating build costs with the supply chain. The capital cost of the power station absolutely must come down. But as we've been through with the Hinkley division of cost, that's not the main driver of cost to consumers. And we have this new financing mechanism. So the other components of the price, which we don't currently know, are what will be the cost of equity, and that will be set competitively. So unlike Hinkley, which was bilaterally negotiated with the government, the cost of capital for Sizewell will be set in competition and therefore should reflect the lowest price that the market is willing to accept to invest.
So when you talk about the 20% cheaper, is that the kind of the build, that's the overnight cost, that's the building of the thing, not included. And then on top of that, you think there'll be further savings from the finance. Is that what you're saying?
So the cost of the consumers will reflect what is the cost of equity, which will be set in competition, and then what is the cost of debt from time to time. And obviously the cost of debt will be quite a dominant feature of the actual outturn cost to consumers.
Okay, but if we're talking about then, I'm just going to do some quick mental maths, and I hope I can keep up with myself. You said that the build cost for Hinkley was only about, would you say 12 or 13 pounds out of the 92? So that would be, let's say 15 pounds out of my 118, out of today, in today's prices, about 15 pounds. And that will become 20% cheaper. So that's going to save you about £3 out of the 118. And then you've got the finance cost, which maybe the 9% cost of capital becomes, let's say 6%. Let's be really ambitious and save a third of the cost of financing. And that should give you another, let's say 20, maybe £25. So you'll be lucky to get this down below £90 per megawatt hour.
Well, we think it will come down below that. And if the government doesn't consider it to be value for money, so if in the government's modelling this does not represent value for money, then it won't go ahead. And that's completely understood.
Yes, but wait a minute, because that's government modelling, and don't forget it's government modelling that gave us Hinkley C and it gave us HS2 and all sorts of other things. So I want to really push on the economics of this, the real economics, because we had a guest, episode 5 of Cleaning Up, Kirsty Gogan, whom I'm sure you know well. This tremendously articulate and charismatic advocate for nuclear power. And she said that Sizewell C should hit a price point of £40 per megawatt hour. And I pushed back immediately and said, look, is that really credible? I asked her. And obviously the implication being, I don't think that's remotely credible. So you're telling me that it's got to be lower than the 90 that I think is credible here, but surely you're going to admit that it's higher than 40.
Yes, I'm not at all claiming that it's going to be 40, and of course I don't have to hand exactly what Kirsty was basing the 40 on, but no, it's not going to be 40. I mean, what I would say about the real economics is, if you go back to sort of fundamentals, like France actually has cheaper and greener electricity than we do. You look at things like the article in The Economist last year, which said that if nuclear had been built out in the way which was planned in the 80s, then we wouldn't have global warming. How much money would that be saving on the whole? And I think the other thing I'd refer to when you look at real comparisons is that without at all denying that the waste product of nuclear is more expensive and difficult to deal with than the waste products of some other ways of making electricity, it is actually all planned in and priced in the price. And so it is very hard to make straight economic comparisons between the impact, benefit and disbenefit of building nuclear with the impact and benefit and disbenefit of building other things. It's hard to compare on a completely straightforward basis.
Well, yeah, and you say it's hard. It is indeed hard. And this example of France always get trotted out. And of course, I could come back with two really important points. One is that right now, the French nuclear fleet has never produced, or not for sort of living memory, so little power. Of the 56 plants, nearly half of them are actually down as we speak. Some for planned maintenance, but some for unplanned maintenance, corrosion in 6 of them, suspected corrosion in 5 or 6 more. So this reliability of nuclear, which gives it its value, its kind of claim to be worth more, is actually built, you could argue, on sand. And then the other point that I could make is that for all the French green electricity and its great statistics on grams per kilowatt hour of carbon, it also has a major utility, which is repeatedly being rescued by the government. This is about the 3rd or 4th. We're now talking about this Project Hercules. And I realize it's probably a bit delicate for you because this is EDF. You're sort of not maybe your employer right now, because that's Sizewell, but the founder of the project. Sorry, I apologize.
My very close connection.
Your very close connection, exactly. Your major backer. Now, they have a market cap of 31 billion euros, debt of 40 billion euros, undiscounted liability for decommissioning of plants, which is somewhere possibly around, depends on what you think they'll cost to decommission, but potentially somewhere around 30 or 40 billion unprovisioned. It's got a pension liability, which is unprovisioned by another maybe 20 billion. And it's got another 50 billion or so liability to upgrade the French plants, the old ones it wants to keep open. And then another liability to build new renewables, which is something else it wants to do. So, I mean, it's great having cheap nuclear power, but if you're not really paying the correct price for it, which is what all of that tells me, then that's not much use, is it?
Well, I think that the financial condition of EDF is a very complicated topic on which I'm not qualified to speak, but I would point out that EDF actually sells nuclear electricity at below its cost as part of its deal with the French government, and making, as with many things, making straight comparisons is difficult. I mean, in terms of reliability, if you look at what happened in the UK fleet has been very reliable until actually they didn't invest it sufficiently in maintenance in the 90s, at which point reliability went down. As soon as actually EDF acquired stations and there was much more invested in maintenance, it's had fantastic reliability. And around the world, pressurized water reactors, which is the sort of reactor which the EPR is a variety of, they have 91% availability. So on a global basis, they are very well available. Obviously, everybody needs to make sure that enough is spent on maintenance to maintain full availability, as with anything, as with any way of making electricity.
Right, but when you talk about reliability running, and I actually, I'm happy to concede that point, because I think what's going on in France right now is unique. I would also, to the second part of my point, which you answered first, I mean, first of all, I totally accept that you can't really comment on EDF's financial status. I understand that entirely. But what I would say is you can't claim that nuclear is cheap because look at France, it's cheap, but then come back and say, well, it's only cheap because it's being sold under cost. I can make lots of things cheap if I'm allowed to sell them at a loss.
I do think the selling at a loss is part of the cheapness of nuclear power. It's a particular deal which happens inside France, but I agree it's probably too complicated to compare the French electricity system with the UK electricity system. What we can see is that the French electricity system has very low carbon emissions and generally lower than the UK electricity system.
Okay, but now let's talk about a different aspect of reliability, which is if you are shutting other power stations, there may be coal, we've already largely shut our coal, but now the UK wants to shut old nuclear, which is no longer safe to run, reaching the end of life nuclear, which has got a number of power stations there, but also wants to get rid of its gas, or it's going to have to get rid of its gas to hit the requirements of the Climate Change Act and Net Zero 2050. For that, you have to be able to deliver your power stations on time, not just within budget, which is kind of what we talked about, but also on time. And you can extol the virtues of the EPRs, but the French EPRs are not reliable in the build, are they? They run enormously over, and there's some good examples of that. So you've got Olkiluoto, which is now working in Finland, 12 years behind schedule. Budget went from 3 billion euros to 11. Taishan, China, that one, construction began in 2009, finally started operation in 2019 instead of 2013. So despite being in China, a place where you can get stuff done quickly, 6 years late, budget about 160% of what was planned. And then Flamanville, which surely is the flagship for this technology. I mean, if they can't do it in Flamanville, why on earth they'd be able to do it anywhere else in the world, I don't know. Supposed to cost 3.3 billion euros for Flamanville 3, now expected to cost nearly 20 billion. Supposed to be commissioned in 2012, now thought to be commissionable perhaps in 2023. I mean, it's a devastatingly bad record, isn't it?
Well, if I take each of those in turn, and there are good records of nuclear build around the world, and it tends to be when there's a program and when there's fleet build and people go from one to another because it's only human to learn by doing. Instead, what has happened is that in different countries, there's been a gap in building nuclear, and after a long time, a unitary single project has started up and it hasn't gone well. But if we look at Olkiluoto, for example, it's on. It can provide 14% of Finland's electricity, reduces their dependence on Russia, and it's branded as being Finland's greatest climate act. So it obviously had a late delivery and cost too much, but who now wishes it wasn't built? And I think in lots of ways, it's analogous to a lot of UK big infrastructure where there's lots of criticism of things being late and over budget. And that's not to say that they shouldn't be both on time and within budget. They should, and everyone should make every effort. If you think about HS1, you think about the current press coverage of Crossrail as an engineering marvel in comparison with the coverage 2 years ago. You think about historically, you think about the 1858 sewerage system or the London Underground. No one can imagine life without these things. And so absolutely, we have to make every effort to get costs down, to get these things on budget and to get them built to time. But they're very long-term projects, and how people see them varies over time. In Finland, there's a recent poll which has 74% of the population in favour of nuclear and only 18% opposed, and even the Green Party in Finland is pro-nuclear. So not trying to dismiss your point about Olkiluoto being late and over budget, it was both, but it's also a great thing. Taishan, they obviously had an unrealistic time estimate. It took them about 10 years. That's probably how long it should have taken them. Their mistake was overestimating 4. Their mistake wasn't the 10 that it took. It's got a problem with the design of the fuel rods. That's a relatively contained problem. It's not uncommon to have problems with fuel when reactors start up. The problem will be fixed. And, we should all be delighted that China has a successful nuclear program, because the alternative is in an industrialized country, they're going to burn even more coal or gas unless they have a successful nuclear program. And Taishan, broadly speaking, is a success. It's got a problem at startup with its fuel. It will be corrected. It will be a great thing for 60 years. Flamanville has had a lot of problems, and far from being the flagship, it was the prototype. It was actually the first one to be designed. And I think the way we can look at Flamanville in the UK is that we are lucky that we can learn from it. We can avoid its errors. Hinkley has already shown that it can avoid a big proportion of the errors that Flamanville made. And I say a big proportion, not because it's made some, but because in order of time, if you look at the errors in Flamanville, you can see that Hinkley has advanced beyond the point at which a lot of these errors had already occurred. Ultimately, it will be fixed and it will be a good thing. But the main point for us is that Hinkley is going well. It's benefiting from all this learning around the other EPRs, and Sizewell will benefit from Hinkley. And you can see at Hinkley between Unit 1 and Unit 2, the level of learning and the productivity improvement. I'd say again, humans learn through doing, and this sort of stop-start approach to doing one nuclear project per generation is part of what leads us to the position in which we find ourselves in which it's slow and takes too long, costs too much money.
But your argument for learning, it's a kind of double-edged sword, because here you've got Sizewell C is going to be your fifth project, right? The fifth project for broadly the same technology. And, Hinkley, essentially it's on track and on budget only because the track was allowed to be the full 10, 12 years, and the budget was so enormously royal that you could hardly go over budget, because it's such a lush contract for difference rate. So what you're really saying is that this technology has proven to be really bad, really, it's almost like we're really crap at projects, so please give us more projects so we could get less crap. But it's not a very compelling argument, is it?
Well, obviously, Michael, I would not put it like that. I would say that nuclear power stations are great things. They can be really great additions to a country's energy infrastructure. And that something that people don't understand about and there's no reason why they should. I mean, the nuclear industry has not been the best at communicating, but nuclear is quite heavily nationalised. So each of Taishan, Olkiluoto, Flamanville is first of a kind in its own country. And if you use the analogy of a car, the engine, the basic technology across all PWRs is quite similar. And so in the EPR, that's quite similar. But if you use the analogy of the body of the car, the UK wants the steering wheel on a different side from France. It wants, slightly different braking systems. And so you end up nationalising the design in each of those countries. So the first time you will see what's actually the learning impact is Hinkley Unit 2. And the next time you will see what's actually the learning impact, it will be Sizewell, which we hope will be treated in learning terms as Hinkley Unit 3. And I think if we can't demonstrate learning at Sizewell, absolutely your comments could be proved correct, but I'm very confident that we will.
Okay, so a few more tens of billions, and we should know whether you are going to learn enough to justify the whole thing on top of the billions on Hinkley. But I'm smiling as I say this. For those who are following, on the podcast, they may not see there's a good sort of bit of banter around this as well, because I am actually in favor of giving technologies the chance to prove their place. It just is, this one is so expensive up front. But I do feel on the economics, I want to come back to the regulated asset-based model, because the learning that you've talked about is the physical learning. It's the thing that will turn Hinkley's £13 or whatever it was for the build to £9 or something like that.
Yeah.
But the financing cost, the operating cost, then presumably they'll also be learning, but a lot of that is fuel where we don't control that.
Yeah, that's right. But they'll be similar.
They'll be they'll be similar. But the regulated asset-based model, let's spend a little time on that, because I think we've got, certainly in the audience, some people who are, some people are very financial, they'll know all about it. And then there's some that will never get it because that's not what they do. But there's a big chunk in the middle who are probably kind of, oh, that sounds interesting. So could you explain what is the regulated asset base approach, particularly as it's going to apply to Sizewell C?
Yeah, sure. So the regulated asset base approach was was devised for infrastructure in the UK in order to privatise it, essentially. And so it applies to the national grid, it applies to lots of electricity distribution networks, it's applied to the water industry, it's applied to airports in particular. And what was achieved in the water industry is that something which had always applied to a water network as a whole was applied to a specific project, being the Thames Tideway Tunnel. And so that's what we are largely looking to replicate for Sizewell. So in the construction period, investors, equity and debt investors, will receive a return on capital at an amount, regulated, set in advance. And that stops interest building up in the way that interest builds up and up and up for Hercules, rolls up like for a credit card. That part of the cost is taken out, and that's a big chunk in why the costs are lower. And then once it's operating, then it's paid its capex and it's paid its opex as we generate, but the formula will not be the Hinkley formula, which incentivizes the maximizing of generation. So you're paid by reference to how many megawatt hours you've put onto the grid. It's going to pay Sizewell to be available so that Sizewell can fulfill the role over the decades in which it will be a useful asset, which is most useful to consumers from time to time.
Okay, so broadly speaking then, let me see if I've understood it. There's two phases. There's the construction phase where you've got no revenues as the project, and therefore, and if it's perceived as risky and therefore the cost of capital is high, then you get this ballooning of the financing amount and therefore cost, yes, which then has to be paid off through the life of the project. So that is kept down by essentially the government underwriting everything, and it's a return, but it's not some supernormal return.
Yeah, and the government, I have to stress the government doesn't underwrite everything. The equity remains heavily incentivized to control construction costs. So construction cost overruns are shared between equity and consumers. And that's essentially what happens in all regulated asset bases.
Okay, but this pretense that it's a sort of fully commercial asset with only the private sector taking risk, that's gone in exchange for lower financing costs during that period.
Exactly.
And then there's the operating period when you are producing either electricity or some other benefit, even if it's just waiting to produce or producing for some other, the heat or hydrogen or whatever, but you're ready to go and produce electricity to keep the lights on. And there's a stream of revenues of various sorts. And that is the second phase. Those will be covered by some kind of contract for difference, but it will allow Sizewell C to be flexible, to switch between the different uses of its electricity or of its output.
Yes, that's right. And as for other regulated assets, the return for equity will be set by Ofgem periodically. So every 5 years, Ofgem will set the return for Sizewell's investors in the same way that Ofgem sets the return for investors in grid and distribution networks.
Okay, but I think that point about flexibility is very important, because the way that Hinkley works is it is paid to produce electricity, and it wants to do that whether that electricity is needed or not needed. And that's similar to offshore wind. And we've seen offshore wind, or in fact renewables overall, being paid not to produce. They're not paid to go off and produce hydrogen or to do something else. They're just paid to produce electricity. So that's what they demand being allowed to do, or to be paid not to do. And this will be different, right?
Exactly so. And I think, this problem of lumpy electricity production and constraint payments is one which I know that people in government and Ofgem are looking at very closely, because what we want to do is to make the most of the opportunities to maximise the use of the electricity and not be paying people to produce electricity that can't be used.
Right. Now, one of the things, if we go back to your statement about this is going to save people money, you have to have a kind of counterfactual for the other ways to do everything that you want Sizewell C to do.
You do.
And those things, I mean, there are a number of ways that you could fulfill that demand. You could use pumped storage and connections to Norway. You could overbuild. I mean, if the levelized cost for Sizewell C is £90, you could build nearly twice as much offshore wind and just hope that some of it somewhere is working when you need it, in economic terms, not in maybe in market regulation terms. I have a very small investment in something called X-Links, which is building 10.6 gigawatts of wind and solar in North Africa and some batteries, and it will have 90% dispatchability by bringing it around the coast, never lands in Europe, comes around the coast into the UK via a high voltage DC under the ocean, under the seafloor, on the seafloor cable. Mm-hmm. You can do energy efficiency. We could save however many gigawatts Sizewell C is going to be. We could take that money and put it into dispatchably, reliably reducing demand. So there's lots of things we could do that I'm guessing would cost, let's call it £50, £60 per megawatt hour. And Sizewell C is going to cost, we sort of came out at somewhere around below 90, but let's call it maybe 80 to 90 pounds per megawatt hour. And then are you going to say that we should still do it because we'll learn so much that we will then be able to use that in future gigawatt scale nuclear?
I'm saying that you have to take account of everything that you're buying. So you have to accord a value to energy security of having something which can be made almost entirely once it's operational onshore. We are very interested in using the existing stocks of uranium that's already in the UK and re-enriching, and so that we're not causing new uranium mining. And energy security has a value, which I think historically hasn't really been taken into account. And we also contribute an awful lot to social value. And I'm not suggesting that, creating better lives for people in remote coastal communities is in itself a justification of a choice of electricity technology, but it is an absolutely huge benefit of nuclear power stations, as are all of the skills training that nuclear gives rise to. So if you think about, one of the huge skills shortages in the UK is welding. We've historically imported our welders, and if you go through the whole chain of why is that, you can bring it back to the fact that further education colleges haven't been able to afford to run welding courses. There's just been a dearth of welders, and through nuclear, because we need a lot of UK welders, we actually have welding academies, and our trained welders who will be able to weld to a very high spec are then available to weld for anything which needs welding to a very high spec. And these things don't really get valued in things like government business cases, but they do have a value. And it's another way in which it's simply not straightforward. And again, nuclear actually pays for in its price the whole cost of decommissioning and waste management. Decommissioning and waste management tends to be treated as a negative in discussions of nuclear, but actually you could look at them as a positive. The whole life cycle is priced in. And the other thing I'd say about Sizewell C is it will have absolutely exceptionally low life cycle carbon emissions. So we've had an independent study done by Ricardo and verified by WSP. It's really granular. It looks at the content of everything that we're using, and it comes out at 5.5 grams per kilowatt hour. That's around about half the level attributed to wind by the IPCC. And so for people who are looking at how to lower the carbon content of their portfolio, an investment in Sizewell C will be very helpful. So all of these things I realise are softer justifications than the straight, is it the cheapest thing we can do? It depends on what you put into your column of what you're needing to provide.
Right, and I buy that. I buy the story about skills. I buy the welding story. I've been up in Barrow-in-Furness looking at some of the welding going on submarines, and being good at welding, being really, really good at welding. It's not sort of a thing that sounds very glamorous in, Islington or Notting Hill Gate or wherever, but it's really important for a country.
Really important.
Really, really important thing. I buy the low carbon. I buy the decommissioning costs if they have indeed been properly accounted for. I actually buy one thing which you didn't mention, which I'm a big fan of, which is that nuclear is not just about nuclear power stations. Nuclear technology plays a role in health, and it plays a role in the food industry, and it plays the role in how do you measure things. There's all sorts of, you know, little bits of the economy which rely on engineers knowing how to handle and how to being able to produce nuclear isotopes and so on. So I think there's a lot of co-benefits. The jobs one more generally, that does make me smile, because there was this fantastic tweet. Hinkley C, the Hinkley team, tweeted this thing in May 2019. They said, did you know, and actually it wasn't the Hinkley team, it was something called Somerset Larder, who are obviously somebody who's got this huge contract to do catering for the Hinkley building site. And they said, did you know we sell 7,800 sausages every day to feed Hinkley C workers, and we deliver 316,000 kilos of beans every year, et cetera, et cetera. And I calculated, I took the National Audit Office's estimate of a £30 billion subsidy, and I worked out that if you took those 7,800 sausages per day for 10 years during the building of Hinkley C, it worked out as a subsidy of £1,430 per sausage.
Only if you were only getting the benefit of sausages from this machine rather than all of the benefits it will bring. And if we talk about, you know, Somerset Larder, I mean, Somerset Larder is actually a great example of the sort of thing a big project can do, not just a nuclear project, but Somerset Larder is a collection of small Somerset businesses who aggregated in order to cater for the site. And one of the things I do feel really strongly about is, if you're going to build something like Sizewell, because you want the electricity and the heat and you need it in your system, and it you know, is affordable and offers value for money, if you're going to do it, you definitely should do it in a way which brings the most benefit. So if you're going to do very large scale catering, make sure you're doing very large scale catering in a way which really works for Suffolk, which reduces food miles, which gives people opportunities, all of that sort of thing, which really requires thought. It's not really money, it requires a lot of thought about how you put your project together.
Right, and obviously I'm making a humorous point by ascribing the entire subsidy cost for Hinkley to the sausages. And by the way, I'm sure they are absolutely fantastic sausages. And if anybody from Somerset Larder is listening, I in no way impugn the quality of your sausages. I would love to tuck into one at some time.
But you're talking about it. I don't know if you recall an episode of Bagpuss where they're producing chocolate biscuits, and the mice are just taking the biscuit, running around the back of the machine, pretending to do something, and then coming out with the same biscuit. And that's obviously not what Hinkley is doing. Hinkley is not a sausage machine, it's making electricity.
No, but the serious point is that those sorts of subsidy figures that are being thrown at Hinkley, and that you know, the subsidy figure or the excess cost, potentially of Sizewell C as well, that's a really, really inefficient and expensive way to provide an economic stimulus. And so I would sort of push back on the generic jobs argument. The specific skills argument, I buy, and I more than buy. But the generic, oh, well, it doesn't really matter because we'll just, you know, we'll essentially overcharge people for electricity and put it into local businesses in Somerset or in, you know.
I completely agree with you. If Sizewell is given the go-ahead, it's because it is considered to be the best thing to do for the UK in order to buy what Sizewell brings, which other ways of delivering electricity don't bring.
Okay, now I want to give you a chance to deal with two other things that are, I suspect, often thrown at you. So I suspect you'll have brilliant answers for them. One is, oh, nuclear shouldn't be built because it can't get commercial insurance. So let's talk about how nuclear is insured and which bits can't be insured. And then the other thing is, what about radioactive waste? Because we don't have a solution for radioactive waste. So this whole discussion we shouldn't have been having at all, because there's no solution for long-term storage of radioactive waste. So if you can, rapid fire, insurance and waste.
So insurance, Sizewell is commercially insured, including for nuclear third party, or will be commercially insured, including for nuclear third party liability. There is international legislation which has extended the ambit of nuclear third party liability into a couple of categories where it's possible there won't be commercial insurance, in which case the government will be insurer of last resort, as it is, for example, for Tideway Tunnel, if Tideway Tunnel can't obtain a particular form of insurance. but the vast majority of Sizewell's liabilities will be commercially insured on the markets. Radioactive waste, everything produces waste, and nuclear actually deals with its waste. So I use my Coke can analogy. If all of your electricity for all of your life came from nuclear, you would use a Coke can of uranium. And at the end of your life, the waste resulting from your whole life's use of nuclear electricity would fit back in that Coke can. And what we do with the radioactive waste from a nuclear power station is we encase it in concrete, and it sits completely safely. You can go and touch it. If you wanted to, you could hug it. It sits in a Sizewell dry store. It's volumetrically small, and it can stay there. I think there's a safety case for 100 years. If it needed to stay there for another 100 years, you could reconcrete it. It's government policy to build a geological disposal facility, and they've built a geological disposal facility in Finland at Onkalo, and they've got the consenting to build facilities in Sweden and in France. If ultimately the government doesn't build a geological disposal facility, the waste is safe, it sits cooling safely, it's not subject to terrorism, it's not the Simpsons, it's not sitting in, you know, green ponds of sludge minded by Homer. It's sitting encased safely in concrete.
Does it not start off in a pool of water which can, you know, leak or boil over or all the rest of it? Doesn't it spend some time in a pool first, and yes, then it goes into these concrete?
Yes, it spends about 18 months in the fuel pond in the reactor. But it's, as you would imagine, Michael, designed not to leak to an extremely high standard of safety and continually checked and monitored. And then it goes into the dry store. And although there's been obviously a big cost issue associated with the decommissioning of historic nuclear in the UK, new nuclear power stations are designed to be decommissioned. It's understood how to decommission them, and you can actually defuel an EPR very quickly in around about 24 hours. Whereas if you look at something like the existing advanced gas-cooled reactors, the ones that are reaching the end of their lives now, that's sort of 3 to 5 years to defuel. And if you look at the old Magnox stations, they spend a long time cooling down. And so, you know, you can see that there is actually great progress in nuclear design.
Right, because we have in this country a liability for decommissioning of past nuclear, which is somewhere, if you add the Nuclear Decommissioning Agency together with the fund that EDF co-manages for those Magnox reactors, the advanced gas-cooled reactors, rather, I think it is, that you add that together, you get somewhere between 150 billion pounds in real terms, discounted, not undiscounted, 150 billion, and it depends what discount rate you use. It could be as high. They used to think it was 250 or 270 billion, and then they decided to use a different discount rate because the number was too scary. But and about half of that, I think, is Sizewell, is the old Sellafield site, which is an absolute mess, right?
Sellafield. Yeah, I mean, yes, Sellafield was used for all sorts of experimentation for both military and civil purposes through the 1940s and 1950s. What was done wasn't adequately documented. It's a huge task to clean it up. I'm in no way trying to minimise the need to or cost of dealing with Sellafield. It's not analogous in any way to whether or not we understand how to decommission and the cost of decommissioning and the cost of storing and disposing of the waste from a new nuclear power station. It is a historic problem, which, as you say, is an expensive historic problem.
Right. And of course, Sellafield used to be Windscale until there was the Windscale fire. And so then it got rebranded Sellafield. So the kind of, a little bit of reputation management there, but it leaves the financial liability. On the question of the waste, I was, in preparation for this, I rewatched a tremendous sort of 15 or 20 minute segment of a Dutch comedy show. There's a comedian called Arjen Lubach, and he did a section on nuclear power. And and it's hilariously funny, even translated into English. And I will put it in the show notes because everybody should watch it. And he actually shows these two warehouses, one with mid-level radioactive waste and the other with high level. And he says, that's it. So when we talk about the terrible problem for future generations, it's literally don't go in that warehouse. The rest you can do. And
they actually use that warehouse to store art because it's climatically controlled to the right level. I think the Dutch have been incredibly clever around the way they've communicated this. They the way they paint the outside of the building shows the cooling. And I think if you came to Sizewell B, Michael, I mean, I know you studied nuclear, so you do understand this, but if people came to Sizewell B and saw these concrete canisters, they're inert, you can touch them. I think what people imagine about nuclear waste, they would find this very, very calming. And there are actually other technologies in development. I'm a non-executive director of a small nuclear company called Nucleo. And there are other designs, like GE has a design called Prism, and they're designed to actually burn some of the waste, and that would in itself reduce the waste stocks in the UK. I think when we look at all these problems, we have to remember that what's in our atmosphere is all sorts of other awful products of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, which is all of this carbon. And the cost of dealing with Sellafield is high. The cost of dealing with the waste from a new nuclear power station is actually not very high, but we have to always compare it with the cost of making electricity as we have historically made it.
And you segued there actually to the last question I wanted to ask you, which is about small modular reactors. And you talked about this one, Nucleo, which actually consumes previously wasted nuclear materials. But there are something like 50 or 60 different designs. You're involved with Nucleo, as I understood it.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, is this an interim, is this a rearguard action that you're fighting on behalf of gigascale nuclear? Because really, in your heart of hearts, you know that the economics have been tested to destruction, and that really to get the learning, we need to get these smaller models, which will then encapsulate learning similar perhaps to offshore wind or even solar, or all the other things that we build repeatedly on a 1-year cycle or a 2-year cycle, rather than a 20-year, 15-year, even maybe at best a 10-year cycle.
I absolutely think there's a future for both. In the UK, there are not many sites suitable for gigawatts, so I don't think there'll be more than another 2 or 3 gigawatt power stations after Sizewell, just because of the physical constraints. I think there's a great future for small modular reactors. I think they'll end up doing different things. I think that some designs, like there's a Urenco U battery, which is designed really for industrial process. There's, as you said, the Nucleo design, which is designed to burn waste. There's Rolls-Royce's small modular reactors. So I think that these small designs will find their own role in the system. In some cases, it may well not be providing grid-scale electricity. They may be for heat. But because it's rightly a very thorough process to license a nuclear design in the UK, and then to find a way of working with the regulator to make sure that you're building with the appropriate level of quality assurance from all of your pieces of kit, it's not quick. And so if we wanted to wait for some of these small designs to be licensed and provably buildable, then I think we'd be waiting a long time. And while we were waiting, we'd be burning gas. So I think that we need the gigawatt to go ahead on the few sites that there are, and there's a bright future for small modular reactors.
Well, thank you very, very much. It is always an absolute delight talking to you, because it's very easy. Nuclear is such an emotional subject for so many people, both the people who support it to the extent where they think that they'll get it built by attacking wind and solar, but it's also emotional for the people who attack it on the other side. And, I've been involved in debates where, former members of parliament in Switzerland have claimed that Chernobyl killed 1 million people for no other reason, with no basis in fact, but simply to they get so emotionalized in the discussion. So it's tremendous to come back and actually talk to somebody who is, coldly rational and working on the nuclear build. It's actually a real relief.
Well, thank you. As you can see, my sign says, "We can do it." That's an old Westinghouse sign. And I do think, I would say, I think it's really sad that so many people, particularly in environmental NGOs, haven't come to terms with nuclear. Because if we think about what we could do if we actually all worked together, it would be tremendous. It's incumbent on us, the nuclear industry, to better communicate. Your examples of the Dutch are great. There should be much more of that. And I would appeal to people like from Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund for Nature. I would appeal to them to look again, in the face of the climate crisis, at what's the real detriment of nuclear. Could we actually all work together and make this a better place?
So, Julia, perhaps you should invite them all, and I'll come along as well, to Sizewell B to be calmed and reassured And even those ultra environmentalists will be left chanting, we can do it. Yes, we can.
That is a very good note to end it on. Do please come to Sizewell B and see the waste. We can do it.
Julia, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
So that was Julia Pyke, Director of Financing for Sizewell C, the gigawatt-scale nuclear power station that EDF wants to build on the UK's Suffolk coast. Cleaning Up is brought to you by Capricorn Investment Group, the Lee Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation.